If you want to learn React in a professional and fun way, it was a good decision clicking on this video here. This 1 hour long tutorial is the first hour of my premium React course. Now let's dive right in and explore the application that you are just about to build using React entirely from scratch. Let's explore the first application that you are just about to build. You will build the MovieGrid web application. Right, it's time for popcorn, find your next movie here. So what we can do is we can see lots of movies right here. We are loading them dynamically from a JSON file. You can see the title here, we have some sweet effects. You can add them to a watch list, right? You can also remove them from a watch list. You can take a look at your watch list, so we have specific routes in our application. You can also remove them from here, right? We can search, so let's say we wanna see that Dark Storm movie here, right? We can just filter by genre, for example. So we only want to see some horror movies. We can filter additionally by rating. So we can say, okay, only show me the baddest ones that you got, nightmares, threshold, right? Or we can go to all. We can also combine all of them. So we can say, I want to see horror, or let's say I want to see fantasy, right? And then I want to see only the good ones. And from the good ones, I only want to see that one that says mystic. There we go, everything's combined. So the first application that you will build is this beautiful designed web application, which is called MovieGrid. Now, let's dive right in. Before we can start working on our first React application, let's just set up all the tools that we need to be able to work with React. And first of all, we will install a code editor. Now, in this course, we will use Visual Studio Code, which is an IDE that I highly recommend. It's getting used quite often. So simply go to code.visualstudio.com and then click on download. You can download it for Windows, for Linux, and also for macOS. So simply click on download for your operating system and install it using all the default settings. Once the installation has completed, you will see a desktop icon, or you can simply search in your search bar for Visual Studio Code and then open it up, and it should look like this. Now please understand that there are two code editors powered by Microsoft, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, and we want to use the lightweight version, which is Visual Studio Code, which is perfect for web development based on JavaScript or TypeScript. Perfect, so that was quite easy. Let's move on to the next lesson. For our upcoming React application, or for basically any React application, you will need Node.js. So this is not optional, you have to install Node.js, right? So go to nodejs.org, then, well, click on the download button at the top right. And the version that I am using is version 21.7.3. That's the latest one as of today. So I always recommend that you use exactly the same version that I'm using. So whenever you watch this video and there is another version, simply choose the version that you can see on screen right now. It's version 21.7.3. Now, and chances are that you already have installed Node.js if you are a programmer already, if you have developed something else from maybe another JavaScript library, right? So simply open up your command prompt. You can do that at Windows, at least, if you just go to the search bar, write down CMD, the command prompt, right, and then you write down node and then -v. So node-v, that will print out the version of your Node.js, of your currently installed Node.js. And if you see a difference here, if you're not using version 21.7.3, then please go ahead and, well, update your Node version. If you're familiar with that, you know how that works. If you're new to Node.js, as I said, simply install it, version 21.7.3, install it with all the default settings again, right? And afterwards, once you've completed the installation process, simply open up the CMD and write down node-v, right? In that way, you make sure that you, well, you can prove that you have installed Node.js successfully. So if you can see that version 21.7.3, you're ready to move on to the next lesson. Let's install some extensions for our Visual Studio Code editor so that it's easier for us to develop React applications. I highly recommend that you install those extensions. But before we do that, now if you have just installed Node.js while the code editor of Visual Studio Code was open, make sure to close it right now, open up Visual Studio Code again, and now the editor knows or has recognized that you basically have installed Node.js. Great. let's install some cool extensions. In Visual Studio, on the left side, click on Extensions. 4 boxes right here, click on that one, and we will install ESLint. So write down ESLint, it's that one right here, ESLint, right? And then simply click on Install. I've already installed that one, this is why it shows an uninstall button, right? And ESLint is basically just showing us errors while we are typing code into the editor, right? So that one is pretty neat, install it, ESLint. And next up, we will install Prettier. So write down Prettier, which is just helping us right now. Here you can see it, Prettier code formatter. It's just formatting our code. That's also a very great extension. So go ahead and install that one too. Now the next thing that we have to do is not to install an extension, but we have to toggle a setting. So let's go to File, let's go to Preferences, let's go to Settings right here. Okay, so File, Preferences, Settings, and then simply search for Format on Save. Great, and then tick that box, so whenever you save a file, it will format the code which is inside. That's pretty cool. So tick that box, and then we are done. Great, now you have all the tools and extensions installed to start developing React applications. So let's set up our first project. Hey, please allow me to promote my full course real quick. If you like my teaching style and you want to learn more about React, please make sure to check out the full course in the description below or popping up right now in the top right corner. The full course covers every important React topic, so enroll now and learn React from A to Z. Let's set up our very first React application. On the left side, we can now go to the Explorer again. So we have installed Node.js in an earlier lecture. So right now go to the 3 dots at the top, go to Terminal, and then open up a new terminal. Now please notice that we will now be in a specific path. Once it's loaded, you can see that I'm in C, users, Yannick, right? So this is basically just my path. You can also change it just using the default comments. For example, if you want to change a directory and your path, you can use the comment CD for change directory, but we will stay inside of that folder right here. I just wanted to tell you. So if we want to create a React application, we have to use npx. That's a nice and easy way to execute comments, right? And we write down create-react-app, and we will call our application MovieDux, right? So again, npx, then the comment is create React app, right? So this one here is the comment, keep that in mind, and then you just provide a name, MovieDux, right? Simply hit enter, and this will set up our project. Great. So while this is happening in the background, you can see that it's installing packages, right? It's installing React, React DOM, and React scripts. And what we want to make sure is that you're using, again, the exact same versions as I am. React, React DOM, React scripts, right? We will do that just in a second. I will show you how that works. For now, just install it, because the very important part here is that you use the same version, because a video course like this one here, especially for React, is really hard to maintain when versions are getting updated, right? You know, when a version changes, usually you just face 1 or 2 smaller adjustments, nothing really groundbreaking, right? But every now and then, maybe just the routing, for example, gets changed, and then you're facing struggles when you not use the exact same versions as in the course. So I always highly recommend that you install the tools exactly with the versions that I use. Now, he's done now. Success, created MovieDux at C users Yannick. He will be your name for sure, and then /MovieDux. And we can start our application using npm start. But before we do that, as I said, we now want to make sure that you use the exact same versions as I am. So first of all, we want to open up our folder now with our application inside, right? So what we can do here is to open and then simply pick the folder with that application. So MovieDux right here, hit select folder, and that will open up a new instance of Visual Studio Code, or we will just replace your current instance. It really depends if you have something else opened. And then you can see here is the folder on the left side, including some of the things from our project now. And now we can use Visual Studio Code basically within that folder. Cool. So how do you make sure that you use the same versions of React, React DOM, and React scripts and all of that, just as I am? Go to the package JSON, and as I said, React is using Node.js, right? And each Node.js project or each project that uses Node.js has a package JSON where all the packages that you need for that application are specified, including the version. So here, those ones, React, React DOM, React scripts, and not the web vitals, that one here. So please make sure that you write them down in exactly the same way as I did. If you want to zoom in, just like I did, hit Control and then the plus sign. So write down 18.2.0 and don't forget to add that sign here, right? And then again 18.2. So we're using React version 18.2, right? And React scripts 5.0.1. Okay, that's really crucial. You can do basically the same for this one here. So all the dependencies that we have, just make sure that you're writing them down in exactly the same way using the versions. Cool. Now, once you have done that, we are not done yet. You can close the package JSON. So in order to upgrade all of your dependencies now, first of all, delete the Node modules folder. Simply click on delete and move to the recycle bin. And you do exactly the same with the package log.json. Now that might take a short amount of time. Let's just wait for it. There we go. Now it's done. And then we also remove the package log.json. Let's just delete that one too. But as I said, very important, keep the package JSON, right, with all of our versions. And now open up a new terminal. And please notice that we are now inside of our folder. We are inside of MovieGrid, right? And write down npm install. And what this does is it goes into the package JSON and installs everything what's mentioned inside. All the dependencies, all the packages that we need with that related version that you have just written down there. So let's just give it a second. And as you see, it's installing the packages. And let's wait until it's done. Once the process has finished, you can see the Node modules folder again right here, and also the package log.json. So inside of that Node modules folder, there will now be all the dependencies with that related version that we wanted to install. And now to validate that everything is working, simply write down npm and then start. Let's just hit npm start. Let's give it a second to load. You can see it's starting the development server right here, and it will open up a new browser instance. I got that on my second screen right here. And if I pull that over, you can see it's still loading, but in a second, once it's done, you can see that your React application is working. And now you're using all the versions that I am, so you can simply work through this course without any struggle. Perfect. So let's move on to the next lesson. As we've already discovered, our React application is now working. And you can see that it is running on a specific URL, which is localhost. And then you can see a colon here. Port 3000, right? So localhost basically always means that Node.js set up a local web server on your machine, and inside of that one, there is a port, a specific web application that got just set up, right? A server. Inside of that server, you have that React application, and that web server on your local machine is hosted on port 3000, right? Or it's running on port 3000. Cool, so let's take a look at the project that got created, right? You can see the Node modules folder. We have already talked about that one. Then you have a public folder, you have a source folder, you have a git ignore file. If you're familiar with version control using Git, you definitely know what that is. If you have no prior experience, just ignore it for now, right? Git ignore it. And then, yeah, let's just get to the public folder first. So inside of the public folder, we can put files there which are accessible, right? So if you would write down the path right here, so localhost 3000, and then you would say /favicon.ico, you will get to the icon right here, right? So it's accessible. We can put things into the public folder and then we can access them. So favicon index.html, we got a logo right here, and that's it basically. And the most important folder is the src folder source. Inside here, we basically have all of our code. We have an app CSS file, which is basically just for styling. We have an app.js file, which we'll get to just in a second. We have an app test file, which is for testing procedures. It's not that important right now. And the most important file here is the app.js, because basically that's our root container here. It's our application just set up, right? Let me just resize that a bit. So we've got a function, an app, and that's, as I said, it's the root, right? Everything starts right here. We have a div, and then we have a header inside this one, and then we have our logo, right? I will just show that again. You can see it's that spinning sign right here, that spinning logo. And then we for sure have some text and then an A tag, whatever, right? So what you can see here is a mix of JavaScript code and HTML, right? And the combination between both of them is called JSX, right? JavaScript and HTML, JSX. Now please, one important thing here, or just for your interest, React and JSX can really get used like without each other. So JSX has nothing to do with React, it's not dependent on React. So chances are that you in future maybe see another front-end framework which is also using JSX, the syntax that you can see right here, JavaScript and HTML. Cool, so what all of this does, we'll get to that just along the way for sure when we start working on our first application. But before we can start working on our first application, we have to make sure that we import all the resources that I have prepared for you, right? Because I really sat here for a couple of days and created some styling while I worked out this course, and you want to make use of it. So in the next lesson, we will download all of the resources and then import it to our project. But before we do that, let's go again to the public folder, because I want to show you how you can actually change that React app title right here. We don't want to use it because our application is called MovieGrid. Let's go to the public folder. Let's go to the index.html right here. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see an HTML tag called title, which is just giving a title for the tab. And then you can write down here MovieGrid, right? Great, save it like this. And you can now see MovieGrid, that's changed by adjusting the index.html. And if we just take a look here, if you're just curious and if you're wondering, okay, how is it possible that we have an HTML file called index and inside there we got the JSX, or basically our app.js component, right? We got that inside there. Well, this is done because here we have the very popular body tag of HTML, and then we have an element called root. And our app.js, the only React component that we have right now, gets injected into that root. So it just gets rendered inside of that root right here, inside of our index.html. And as you can see, and as we have discovered, the index.html file is in the public folder. So we can go to index.html, which is exactly the file, because an index.html file usually is the default page, and it is for our React application too. Cool, so let's move on to the next lesson where we install all the resources that I've prepared. We will change the favicon and import all the styling and images. So let's move on. So I've prepared a nice CSS file for you for that application. So some sweet styling, some images, a favicon, and a lot more. So please go ahead and download the attached file called resources.zip, which is an archive. And inside there you can find everything what we need. So just take that folder right here, resources, I'll make it obvious, drag it to the desktop that you have, right? Go to Visual Studio Code. I will resize it. As I said, we don't want to make any copy paste mistakes right here. So let me just close everything here. First of all, open up the resources folder. And inside here we have an image folder, favicon, logo, movies, JSON file, and styles. We want to take the styles file first. Let me just resize that a bit. So just like that. And we want to put that file close to the app CSS file that we have right here. Okay, so take it and put it into this source file. You can see here styles.css. Great. Then we can close it. As I said, really make sure that the file is inside of the folder src source, right? Styles as CSS, because if we don't do that, it will not work later on. Then take the movies, logo, fav, and the images folder, the entire folder, right? And then drag it. Let me just resize that again. And then drag everything into the public folder, all right? Because all of this has to be accessible from the public or from the URL. We want to take those images and load it from there. We want to have the PNG and the logo and all of that, okay? So the start CSS goes to the CRS folder, to the source folder, and everything else, you put that into the public folder. And it's important that inside of the public folder, you have another folder now called images with all of the images, 20 right now, okay? Great. Now, once that's done, you have everything that you need for our application. And we can see if everything works here. If we go to the index.html, it should be opened again. If you don't know where it is, it's in the public folder, index.html, right? And I have created a new favicon. We still have the old one. It's called favicon.ico, but we will rename it to fav.png, right? That's the icon that I've created. Save it and then take a look at your React application. You just pull that over here. And you should see that little duck favicon right here, right? So pretty cool. Now everything is prepared so that we can move on and finally start working on our MovieDucks React application. Let's close the index.html that we have right here. Let's close the public folder and open up the source folder and go to the app.js. As I said, right now, this one here is generating our application, right? You know, in React, we have components, and each component can again have nested components inside. So you have one component, one big component, right? And inside there, you have maybe 3 smaller components. Right now, we have the app right here. Think of it like one big component, the app component, and inside there, we can create smaller components again. We will get to that just step by step now, right? But that's basically what the app right here is doing, the function app. We have one component which is getting rendered inside of our index.html then, right? In order to make use of our style that I've created, you can see that we are importing a CSS file here, the app CSS, but we also in addition or mainly want to use my file that I've created for our application, which is /, and then you write down styles.css, write it in lowercase because as you can see here it's written in lowercase. It's all right. In that way we will tell React, hey, go ahead and take the style.css from the source folder. Cool. Now let's rework our application. For example, we can just remove everything inside of that header. So let's remove the image, the A tag, just like this. Now, as you may have seen already, usually if you're familiar with HTML, you would take class and then assign CSS classes, right? But that name is reserved, right? We cannot use it in React. So if we want to use React to apply styling, we take the class name keyword. So totally in React, forget about class, right? To assign styling, we always use class name. So if we take class name and we put down header here, let's just write that header, and we save it just like that, then we will use the styling from our styles.css, and inside here we have a header class, right, which is just adding some margin, and he will use that one, right? So if you want to use CSS classes, use the keyword class name. That's the very first part. Now, next up, let's create an H1 here, and we can say welcome to MovieDucks. We will replace that with a nice logo and all of that just in a second. Welcome to MovieDucks, right? And then we can create a footer, for example, right? We will create a footer along the way, and we can assign a class here too. Class name is now footer. Again, it's exactly the same. I want to apply a CSS class called footer, right? And then finally, we can simply write down here a paragraph, and write down footer content goes here, for example. And again, we want to take class name and write down footer. Great. So save it like this. Go to your application and then take a look. Now inside of our app.js component, we have our header, right? Welcome to MovieDucks. And then we have the footer, right? So this is how we can modify it. Nothing new, nothing special, right? Just wanted to show you that we can obviously just change the content inside of our component, our app component right here. And that you need to use class name to apply styling instead of class. Great. Now let's move on to the next lecture, which is really exciting because there we will create our own component for the very first time. In this lesson, we will create a so-called header component. A component is a reusable piece that you can use in your React application whenever you need it. So it's modular, right? You can create it and then put it 3 times after another, or you can put it in one file and in another file again. So as I said, it's a reusable piece, a component. Let's go ahead and create a new folder inside of our source folder. So right click on the source folder, new folder, and write down components. You can write that in lowercase, components. Inside of that components folder, we want to create a new component. Right click, new file, and now very important, and that's really important, components are written in uppercase. The first letter of a component's name is always written in uppercase. So if our component is called header, then we have to write it with a capital H. So header and then .js. Now go into that header.js file, and first of all we want to import React. So let's write down import React from React. Great. So in that way we get access to all of the important React functionality that we need, and then let's import our styling, which is coming from one more folder back, so /styles.css, because keep in mind that we are now inside of a components folder, so we have to go back. That's why we add one more dot right here. Great. So we can now use React and our CSS. If you want to create a component and you want to use components in other components, right? So just to keep it simple, we will now create a header component, and we want to take that header component and use it inside of our app component. And in order to make use of it so that we can import our header component from the app component, we have to export it, right? This is basic JavaScript, right? We want to export a default function, which is called header. Okay, so let's add parentheses here, curly braces. In that way, we will export the header component from that file, and then we can go to the app.js and import that component and use it. So we have to export default function header. We can also, so this is like exporting it as a default. We can also export it using a name. We'll get to that later on. Don't worry about that for now. But keep in mind, as long as you just have one component in a file, you can basically always just use export default. That's totally fine then. Cool. So next up, if we go to the app.js here, you can see that we are returning something, right? From our app component, we are returning basically HTML. Right? So again, we will do the same, return, and now take a look at the syntax here. We have some parentheses, right? So return, and then we have parentheses basically, and inside here there has to live, and now pay attention, one parent tag. So we can write down div. That's totally fine, it's working. We are returning that div, and what's ever inside that div, 100 and other HTML elements is fine. But what we cannot do is not to create a sibling. We cannot return multiple tags, right? We have to return one tag, and it's totally fine if there are more tags underneath it, but we cannot return a div and another div. If we want to do that, we have to wrap another div around that, or another, you don't have to create a div. For that use case, you basically have that one right here. You just use it that way. It's just like an empty tag, right? It's not even a div, it's just like an empty thing. So if you now want to have two divs beside each other, right, you can return it that way, because you now have two divs beside of each other as siblings, and around that you have wrapped again one single empty tag, right? So the thing that you should take away now is that if you return something from a component, it always has to be one element. Doesn't really matter what's underneath it, but you have to return one element. Cool. So let me just split that up. Inside here, we will return one div, right? And we will assign some styling here. So write down class name as you have discovered, and let's write down header again. So inside here, we have an image, and that image has a class name, and that class name is logo. And then we have a source attribute. So we're assigning the image, which is logo.png. He will simply go to that public folder here and then pick that logo PNG, right? And then we have to assign an alt, which is pretty good for SEO, right? So alt, and then we have to give any name. So if the image cannot get rendered, it will show that text instead. Let's say movie docs. And then we can leave it like this, totally fine. We can also use the image as a self-closing tag. So we can simply say slash and then closing tag like this. Pay attention, we have one tag. Open up, image, and then we have the closing and right here, the closing tag. As a sibling, so next to the image, we have an h2 with a class name set to app subtitle, there we go. Now we can put in some text here. It's time for popcorn. And then find your next movie here. Great. So it's time for popcorn, find your next movie here. Let me just see if there is a spelling mistake. It's time for popcorn, find your next movie here. Because you know, I'm a course creator for almost 10 years now, and I really hate it so much if at the beginning of the course I'm just doing a spelling mistake and then like do it like instead of, well, time doing like time, and in the end, like for the entire course, you will see that spelling mistake. So let me just take a look again. It's time for popcorn, find your next movie here. Now, it would be funny if there is still a mistake. However, let's move on. Save it like this and then go to the app.js file. And now the magic happens. We now import our component, which is called header with a capital H. We will import the header. Right? And we don't have to put it into quotes because we have exported it as a default, right? So we can just write down header and then from, we import it from, and now we have to specify the path ./components/header, right? Because we got that right here inside of our components folder, we got the header file, the header.js. We're exporting it so we can use it like this. Now, and that's pretty cool, we can just keep the footer like we did right here, but we can take that header and entirely remove it. What we do now is we create a div, and inside that div we will use a class name, which is container. And what that does, I've done that for you, is basically, you know, in modern web applications, you don't use the full width of anything, basically, right? If you just take a look when you're around the web, just pay attention on that. But you most of the time just use the middle part, like 60% of it or what, just a container, because it's really hard for our wide screens to like read like this, right? That's just too much movement for our head, so, or for our eyes. So what we did is like we create for the entire website a container which has less width, and inside there we render all of our content. And this is what this container class is basically doing. It's just setting a width. I just wanted to give you some context here. And now we just put our component, so what we have right here, right, into our container. And the only thing that we have to do for that is to take the header, right? Please notice that this one has a different color and it's written in uppercase. There is a major difference between those two. This one is the standard HTML tag written in lowercase, which will do basically nothing because it's empty. But this one written in uppercase, and components have to use the capital letter, right? This one is now saying to React, once we start that application, oh, he wants to render the header component. He's now going to the header.js, to the component, and just returning what we got right here, which will result in the fact that we will simply render the div right here with all of the content inside. So he will take, he's in the app.js component, he will say, okay, I need to take that header component. He will take whatever it returns, just replaces it there. Great. So if you save your application now and you take a look, you'll be able to see this right here. I have to zoom out a little bit because, you know, I'm always zoomed in my screen. So I increase the entire zoom so that you are able to see that source code in a, well, good way. So it should look kind of like this for you, right? Movie ducks. Please props for creating that nice duck icon, right? It took me like 2 hours just to figure that out. And should look like this, and then everything is working fine, and you got your header component here. And now the cool thing is, I said that headers are, or components are reusable. You can simply duplicate it like 3 times and he will do exactly the same over and over again, right? Now got that 3 times. It's a reusable component, and it will, as you can see, it is for the dry principle, which is don't repeat yourself. So whenever we need that header somewhere else again, we don't have to write down div and blah, 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 and all that styling, just making our code like really spaghetti-like. No, we can simply just use that component again, write down header, and it will render this thing. More on that later, because we have a real use case for reusing a component at different, in different parts of our application. Cool. Now that said, let's move on to the next lesson. It's time to create another component, the footer component. And what we want to do is we want to use this one here, footer content here, right? We want to write down something like movie docs, and then we want to add something dynamic so that it always shows the current year. We don't want to hard code 2024, 2025 or whatever. We want to add it dynamically. So in this component, we will, for the first time, add some JavaScript functionality, some plain JavaScript functionality, right? So first of all, do what you have done before. Right click on the components folder, add a new file, again with an uppercase letter, so capital letter. For the first one, we call it footer.js. And inside here, you can copy that over. We want to go to header.js and copy the first two things, which is import React from React, import styles. Then export default, then function, and then the name of the component, which is footer, again with a capital letter at the beginning, empty parentheses, and then we can write down our return here, again parentheses, just like that. Cool. So we can write down a div here if we like, just to get rid of that error, right? Cool. Next up, as I said already, we want to make sure that inside of the footer we always show the current year. It's always a great idea to, before you start working on your component, think about what you actually want to do, as I did before, right? I showed you our application and said, inside of the footer, I want to show the current year. So in that case, we know that we have to calculate the current year. And therefore, we simply write down const to create a variable inside of our component. We call it current year, there we go. And then we simply use new date, then dot get full year, there we go. This will simply, well, get the current year, and now we can use it inside of our return statement here, so inside of what we want to actually render. Instead of creating a div, we actually want to create a footer here, right? This is a standard, a very default HTML tag, a footer, and then we want to add a class name again. So we want to add some styling, class name, and we want to assign the footer class. You can look up this in the style CSS just if you like, but it's not really important. Whenever I mention that you should look something up in style CSS, I will really tell you when it's important or when not, but most of the style that we have is really simple CSS, so nothing too crazy, because I don't want to well, create things that you cannot follow along or adjust later on your own. So for the P, for the paragraph that we have right here, we want to take the class name and assign footer text class, right? And now let's write down a copyright symbol. And the way I do that, I have to admit, is I simply go to Google and search for copyright symbol. Well, I know that there is a shortcut to create it, but I wasn't able to get it done, so I decided to pick the more, well, lazy way and do it that way. So write down the copyright sign, and now it's the important part. We can jump out of our JSX, which is right here. This is JSX, right? We can use JavaScript and HTML and start using what we have created here. So we can use the current year variable inside of our function, inside of our JSX, so inside of our HTML. So what we do is we take curly braces to jump out to our JavaScript. So now we are in the level that we get access to current year, for example. Then we write down current year, and it will for sure replace current year with the actual value. And then we can say movie ducks. No, write it down with a capital, movie ducks. And then a cool text like all rights reserved, as if it would be a real company, right? Or real software. All rights reserved. So save it. And as I said, now this is JSX, right? We have some plain text here. Then we have some HTML, and then we can pop out to our function again, to our variables, using the curly braces and then writing down the variable name. And in that way, we have combined HTML and JavaScript, or JSX. So save it like this, and then go to the app.js, remove the footer right here, and then simply write down footer in uppercase. Now pay attention, we don't want to add it into the container, because the footer should have a length of or a width of the entire page, right? Not only the container, but the entire page width then. So this is why we have like the footer not inside that div, which has the container here. Cool, save it, take a look at your application, and you should be able to see that header here, which says copyright 2024, movie ducks, all rights reserved. So this is the first time now that you have created a component which is using something dynamic. from a variable that uses just any kind of JavaScript functionality, getting a date, getting a year, whatever, and then you place that value from a variable into your toRender element, right? So simply into that return using JSX. In that way, we have done that dynamically, right? So there was no need to hard code 2024 or whatever year. No, we are calculating that on the fly using some cool dynamic features. Great, now let's move on to the next lesson. Now we will start working on the core component of our application basically, which is the MovieGrid. So now we will create movie cards, right? As you've seen them in the preview, loaded from or dynamically generated from a JSON file. So this will be split up in multiple lectures, right, to keep everything nicely structured and easy to follow. So before we get started by creating a new component, let's just take a look at the things that we have imported. So let's just close the source folder for now, open up the public folder, and then we have the images. Now, as you can assume that those are just any kind of images, you know, I've generated them with AI, I didn't want to use any real images, not sure of the copyright, right? So in that case, I've just generated some images here. They all have a name, right? And then inside of that public folder, we have a file called movies.json. Now go ahead and open it up. If you have no clue what JSON is, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's basically a way on how we can store information, right, in JSON format. And then we can take this JSON format file, so this file that you can see here on screen, we could take it and bring it back to our code. We can import it or read it, right? And then have JavaScript objects from that. So here you can see that we have an array, right? Open up a bracket. And inside here we have an object, a JavaScript object. And that object has in total 5 properties: ID, title, image, genre, and rating. And we can, as I said, read that from our JavaScript again to read that file and then convert it back to JavaScript objects. And then we will have a JavaScript object which has those 5 properties with those values. So JSON is a very popular format that you can find in almost every web application because it's really handy and it's so easy to save data from applications to JSON format and to read data from JSON format and convert it back to JavaScript objects. Basically, this procedure is called serialization and deserialization. Great. So here we have 20 images, right? So we can assume that we also have 20 objects inside here. Each of them is one film actually. And you can see that we have an ID, which will be the unique key. You know, if you load data from a real database later on, using SQL, for example, you will have a primary key. So a unique identifier, which always makes sure that an item is always unique, right? There should not be a duplicate. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to duplicate that last movie here and then use the same ID. We would have to change that manually because we're not using a real database. Cool. So ID, title, image, genre. So this is what we will have to import. We will use the fetch method for that, but we'll get more on that later. Let's close the footer.js, let's close the header.js, and let's start setting up a new component. So let's close the public folder, right click, and then new file, and let's call it MovieGrid, right? Movies with an S, and then grid.js. So MovieGrid.js, and then we can open up the header again and just copy the import statements here, import React from React and import styles. And again, we want to export default and then function, and we call it MovieGrid. Then we have empty parentheses, curly braces then, and we want to return something empty for now. Let's just return the div. Okay. Now it's time to build some real logic for our application. And that's the first time where we will start writing some more, well, logic, right? But before we do that, we have to talk about the so-called state. Because now our application will next up load the movies from our file, and we have to store this information, right? We will use the so-called state in our React application. Just think of your application like this. You have that application, your React application, right? And then you want to store some information like say movies or other information that you have loaded, or just other information that you need later on, maybe in other components, or maybe just something that you need to keep track of, right? Think of it like a variable that you can use, and you will have a method for that variable, right, for that state. And when you update that state, the data that's rendered will get updated too. We will take a look at this in detail in the next lesson. Now let's talk about the state. So state is a very crucial concept of React development. And I get that question, I get that asked quite a lot of times when people say, Yannick, could you please explain the state to me in easy words, right? And the best explanation that I can provide is always the comparison to a default variable. So let's say we would create a const age here, let's say the age is set to 20 or whatever. Now, if we would want to render this inside of our return here, inside of our JSX, we could simply pop out using the curly braces as we have discovered and write down age. Now, why should we use a state in comparison? So why would we now not only load the movies from that file and put the movies into a variable, into an array such as this one here? Now, the problem is that if things change later on, we want to reflect changes automatically, right? So the difference between a state and the variable like this one here is that if we would now render this, it would show 20. And if we change the value along the way by any kind of code later on to, let's say, 27, then the change would not get reflected in the user interface. So it will still show 20, and we would have to, well, re-render everything to see the change getting reflected. And a state is doing that for us. So if we use a state instead, we will have a variable, say movies, and we will create a function for that state called, let's say, set movies. And whenever we change the value of our state, we call that function, which then renders the latest value of that state into our UI. Now, that's the easiest explanation that I can provide. However, it will become clear as day along the way. Well, that was not intentional. Okay, let's move on. First of all, we have to use state and also use effect. Use effect, we'll get to that just in a second. This is for loading the file, but we have to make use of useState. So import React, add a comma here, and then add curly braces because we have a name import, and then write down useState and use effect. I will get to use effect as I said, but use state, we basically need that to use the state, right? We import that from React. Great. Let's, as I said, create the state by setting up const, then add brackets here. Let's say movies. This is, think of it, of the variable, the data that's inside there, what movies have we loaded, right? And then we create a function that we can call to update the movies. Let's call it set movies. This is a pretty default pattern. So usually when you would say movies or users, or let's say animals, then the associated function to call to update the state is called set. So set animals, set users, or set movies. We initialize this with the use state function that we have here. So we say, hey, React, we want to use a state for movies, right? And then finally, you can simply provide a default value, right? A default value, so add the parentheses here. And then we want to start with an empty array. We don't have, or we haven't loaded any movies from the very beginning. You could write here any objects or create objects and put them in there if you want to have a default value. But usually, most of the time, you start with empty data. So let's just put in there an empty array. Again, we have now created a state. We want to store movies, so we will be able to access this, and whatever we change for movies, we can simply call the set movies function here, right? And then we tell React basically to use a state for this, and we initialize the value with an empty array. In the next lesson, we will learn how to use an effect and how to fetch data from our movies JSON, right? So that we can really load our objects. But I just want to give you an example of how you could potentially just use that. Let's just assume we have no types here, right? So movies could be anything. We're not in TypeScript, C# or Java. It's JavaScript, so movies can be anything right now. We have no type safety. Let's just create a const title, or just call them M, that's fine. Const M for movies in short. and that's a new array, and let's just put in any kind of movie titles here, right? They are fake, but that doesn't really matter. Now, we are in JavaScript, so we have no type safety, so movies here could be anything. Now we have created an object here. Let's just assume that those are our movies that we load, right? So now the real question is like, how can we put our movies, our fake movies that we have right here, how can we put them into our movies state? And therefore we have to make use of the effect, because if we do not use it, we will create an infinite loop and React will just create an error for us. So we have to make use of an effect for some side effects, so to speak, which can occur like once when you create a component for initialization, for example, right? We will use that effect anyway, so it's a good practice to just move on to the next lesson, use an effect and then load some demo data, and then finally fetch some real data from our JSON file. Great. So let's move on to the next lesson and see how we can actually update our state with the setMovies function. So how can we now use an effect to actually set the state for our movies state right here? Now, we have to do that because if we just would call the setMovies function here to update our state now, so we could say setMovies and then we assign the value m to our movies state, we will end up in an infinite loop where we will see an error from React side saying, hey, you cannot do that. So we only want to do that once when the component renders first, and therefore we can use an effect. So this is why we have imported use effect right here. We can say use effect, right? Then inside here we have parentheses, right? And we can define a function. So let's say we have an arrow function here, no parameters or whatever. Then we have our syntax, so what we want to execute. And then finally, we can say like, when do you want to repeat it? Any information on when this effect should appear again. But we only want to do it once now when the component renders first. So this is why we provide an empty array. We don't want to provide any information on when to repeat this effect. Now, inside of this effect, we can now say, hey, our MovieGrid component gets rendered, and now we want to say that we want to set the state for our movies. So we can call setMovies, our state or updating state function that we hear, setMovies. Then we open up parentheses and provide the value that we want to set for our state, which is m, right? And keep in mind that m right here, those are our fake movies. Let's take them and put them into the effect, right? Just like that. So now when we render our MovieGrid, then we will update, or this effect will get called once. We will create an array with some fake movies, right? We will set the state for our movies here. Then our component knows, okay, I've got the state. And whenever we again call setMovies, it will automatically re-render. And this is why we have a state here. Now, finally, we can go to our return here, use JSX and then render movies.length, for example, just to see the actual amount of movies that we have inside of our state. So what we want to do is save it like this, go to the app.js now, go to import and then import our MovieGrid from components MovieGrid. Inside of the class name container that we have here inside of that div, we want to add a sibling and write down MovieGrid. So we want to render the MovieGrid here. Let's save it. Take a look at your application and you will be able to see 3. And now whenever we would change the state, we can see the changes getting reflected. Now let's move on to the next lesson and let's explore the famous React dev tools that we can use to simulate such situations. So here we can now see our current fake loaded movie length, right? So it's 3, we got 3 movies. And now it's time to install the React developer tools. Simply open up your browser of choice, go to Google or wherever and search for React developer tools. I always highly recommend that you use Google Chrome just because of accessibility, that you have all the plugins, etc. So React developer tools. I'm honest here, this one is pretty much optional, right? This lecture, you don't have to follow along. It's okay if you just watch, but I recommend if you use React on a daily basis or need to use React on a daily basis, because you're here for, well, learning that for your job, right? You want to use React developer tools. So search for that one. Let's just add it to our browser. You know, that was kind of German, but that should not be a problem. And then once that's done, it got added, right? So I can close that here. And then I can simply go to that extension file and click on React developer tools. Now after reloading the page, make sure to reload it or just close it and open it up again using npm start, but should be enough if you just reload it. And then clicking on React, you should be able to open up Ctrl-Shift-J for the developer tools and for the console. And then if you go to that one here, you should be able to see the components and the profile. And if we go to components, right, then we are inside of the React developer tool. And here you can see our components app had a MovieGrid. Click on MovieGrid. And now, let me just close that here. You can see that we have some properties. Right now we have none, right? But we have a hook. And inside that hook, we have a state, and the state is set to ABC, right? And if you now simply add a new entry here, you can see new entry, and we write down D just like that and hit enter. Just give it a second to load. Then we now have another element inside of our state, and it got automatically updated. And this is why we're using a state. So let's say in the background we have a mechanism that fetches new movies all the time, or new feed updates, new Twitter post or whatever, just to see the latest. We have that state, and whenever we got something new, right, it gets re-rendered automatically. So whenever something gets added or changed or removed, let's say I want to remove the first two movies, you can see we only have 2 movies in our array. And if that would not be a state, but a variable instead, then it would not work. It would not automatically re-render, because variables are kind of static, right, and needs to get manually re-rendered. And that's where the states come in handy. That's the way that React uses to add a great and easy way to automatically update the user interface. And the state and effects are both very important in React development. So it's important that we talk about this a little bit more in depth, right? Cool. Now I hope that's clear now. We can just bring that back here, go to our MovieGrid, and now we have hard-coded our movies here, right, with a fake array, but we will now load our movies from that JSON file and put them here instead. So that's definitely something pretty cool. So let's move on to the next lesson and bring some life into our application now. Alrighty, so now it's time to move on and to get rid of our, well, temporary array here with fake movies. So as you know, we have a movies JSON file. And I've already explained to you that it is inside of our public folder, and therefore we can simply take our browser, let me just bring that over, and we can write down a slash, right? So port 3000 slash and then movies.json, right? And now our browser is sending a GET request to get that resource at this specific URL, and this is why we then can see our content here of that JSON file. And basically what I now did right here by saying, well, get the file movie.json from that URL, we can use a function in JavaScript which is called fetch. So let's write down fetch, and we want to fetch from a URL, and we don't have to provide the entire URL with HTTPS and then localhost and whatever. We can simply write down, as we are inside of the public folder, can say movies.json. So he will automatically say, okay, I'm in that web application, I will search in the browser folder. Because we are, however, inside of that directory, right? Because the index file is also there, the index.html, and close to this one as a sibling, there's the movies.json, so we don't have to provide an additional path like data/movies. We can simply write down movies.json. Now this is an asynchronous operation basically, right? It may take some time. The server has to respond, etc. So afterwards, once we got the result, we will attach a then. So a then promise. What we want to do is we take the response, so whatever we get as a response from that fetch operation here, right? And we take it, response, put it to JSON. So it's a JSON response. And again, this is an operation that we have to wait. So he's taking that response, putting it into JSON, right? And once that's done then, so we are chaining here, right? We are creating a chain, fetch it, take the response, put it to JSON, and then, right, we simply say that we want to take that data, so the final output of that to JSON or JSON call right here, we want to set movies, right, and put in the data from our JSON. And then we can remove this function right here, this call, and it will look just like that. Awesome. So again, we are fetching the information from the JSON file. We will wait, and when it's ready, then we will take that, whatever we got from that file, raw data. We will put it into JSON, so we will have JavaScript objects afterwards. And once that's done, then we want to take that data. So in that case, we will have an array of movies, right? And set it as the current state for our movies object right here. Don't forget that setMovies is the function to set the state movies. Cool. And again, here you can see that we have movies length, right? We're displaying that. So if we save it and take a look at our application, we should be able to see that we now have 20 movies, right? And if we open up Ctrl+Shift+J, take a look at our components here, and we take a look at the movies grid, here we can see the state. You can see that we got all the information here inside of our component. Even though we are not showing it in the UI, user interface, right? We still have it loaded in our component, right? So here we have the genre, the ID, the title, and so on. Cool. And again, the React DevTools are showing that they are worth getting installed. Cool. Now, this doesn't look too good, right? We're just displaying 20 here. So it's time to bring in some sweet styling so that we have a nice responsive grid that shows the actual movies that we have loaded. So now it's time to add some sweet responsive movie cards here, or at least a movie grid, including some cards. So what we want to do is here in our return statement in the MovieGrid.js, we now want to provide a grid. Let's add a class to this div right here, class name MovieGrid, and then we need to call the map function. That's something that especially beginners in JavaScript may have not used before. First of all, let's opt out. Let's get out of our HTML. Yes, let's use JavaScript. So this is why we add the curly braces here. And then we say movies, right? And please keep in mind that movies is an array, right? We store our movies inside. Now the thing is that movies right now is looking like JavaScript objects. We have an ID, title, etc. But that's not how we want to display them right here in our HTML. What we basically want to do is we now want to say, hey, for every movie that we have, create an HTML element, right? So in easier words, if we would have like an array with 10 movies, we would say, hey, for each movie inside of that array, create a list item, for example, right? A little bit simplified, we will create something more comprehensive, but that's the idea. So we call map, movies.map. We are taking the original source, so our array with our movies data, and we are mapping it to display it differently, right? Mapping basically means transforming data. We take our movies array and we transform it. So we map it to something else. And we're doing it for every movie, right? So inside of our movies array, we have 10 movies, let's say. I know we have 20, but let's say it's 10. And we take each movie once. And for each movie in this array that we have, we want to do the following. Add an arrow here and then parentheses, right? And inside of these parentheses, we can now simply say, for example, we create a div, right? So let's just add a closing div here. And inside of that div, we add a so-called key. So, and as I said earlier, if we load data from a real database, then we would also use a key, right? So we have a primary key for each movie. We have a unique identifier, which is the key, and we want to use that for mapping so that React still keeps track of which movie we are talking about, right? So this is what the key property here is doing. And we use movie.id, just like this. Perfect. Now that's the first part. Then for this div, we assign a class name and it will be movie card. Just like that. Then we have an image. There we go, image. And let's set the source. So src equals to, now add curly braces, right? And what we want to do is we want to first of all provide the folder, which is images, inside of our public folder here, images. But this time don't use single quotes or usual quotes. Use that symbol next to that one, just like this. Alrighty, please pay attention. There is a difference between that symbol here and that single quote. Alright, so make sure to use that one because we need it for interpolating. What we want to do is we want to provide the folder images, then slash, and now provide a $sign so that we can opt out or interpolate again to our JavaScript. We have to use that symbol. It is called backtick, right? And so if you want to look it up, it's backtick. I would just write that down if you have any issues here. It's called backtick, right? So if you want to look it up, just search for it. And what we want to do here is we take the movie.image, right? So movie.image, and again, he's complaining because we have to set an alt attribute. Not a problem at all. We say alt, and then we simply remove the quotes, use our curly braces, and write down movie.title. Cool. So what he's doing now, he's generating an image, and we are setting the source path, and we have to use the curly braces here because we have to use some JavaScript. So this is why we wrap it around our curly braces. And here we have to interpolate inside of a string. So this is why we use that backtick. And then basically we're just doing the same for the alt. We can simply use the movie property here for the title. Again, wrap it in curly braces. Now afterwards, let's create another div, right? And also a closing div. And now it will get easier. That was the hardest part already. And we will simply create a class name here, and we will call it movie card info. And then we will have an h3 and 2 paragraphs. So let's write down h3, heading 3, right? And we will have class name called movie card title, right? And what we want to have here is the movie.title. That's what we want to display in that card. We can create a paragraph. Class name for that paragraph will then be the genre, movie card genre. Make sure to not include any spelling mistakes, right? And same here, movie.genre, just like that. And then we can duplicate that one. Class name, this one will be the rating, so movie card rating, and then add the movie rating. Great. There we go. Now let me just sum that up. We have one return statement and we are returning one grid. Inside of that grid, we are taking our array of movies and we are mapping them so that we, for each movie, create one new div where we set the key parameter to the ID, which is unique, so that React can keep track of, oh, that is the first movie, that is the second one. Oh, you want to have the movie with ID 3? Well, this element it is, right? And then we just put in the image, load the data from the folder that we have created, or the image source. We're not loading it, we're just setting the correct path, obviously. And then we just create some simple HTML elements like the title and some more specific things. So let's take a look. That's the easiest way to show it. Please keep in mind that we have already added the MovieGrid to the app.js from a lecture before, so we do not have to add it again. And then take a look at your application, and voila, you are able to see your movies. And you can hover above them and they are moving, so lots of pretty cool things already going on. Not much functionality yet, right? But we are loading data from a JSON file, which works pretty nicely. So you could extend that JSON file to add new movies or whatever. Great. So feel free to explore your application now, hover above it, and you can see the ratings. And then we're ready to move on to the next lesson, where we will talk about refactoring, which is an essential part of React development. Alrighty, now that we are seeing all of our beautiful movie cards right here, it's time to talk about a very important topic, which is called refactoring. And if you are familiar with software development, then you know what refactoring is. But maybe you are a beginner developer, you have not heard about refactoring. So let's tap over to our MovieGrid. Refactoring here will basically mean that we create a new component, a new reusable component for our movie card. We have a MovieGrid component. And inside of that MovieGrid component, right now, we are showing movies, right? But it would be better to just extract this right here, the rendering, put it into a reusable component so that we have a MovieGrid component, right? And inside of that MovieGrid component, we have smaller components for each movie. A movie card, a movie card, a movie card, and so on, right? So in that way, when you want to change the movie card, it would be easier to simply go into the movie card component because it's so obvious that inside there is the movie card, right? So that it's easy to edit, instead of, well, frustrating other developers maybe and make them search inside of the MovieGrid for the specific parts where the cards get rendered, right? So it's best practice to just take that part and create another reusable component. No, you don't want to do that with everything, but whenever it makes sense and whenever it makes your life easier as a developer and makes the code easier to maintain, it's a good idea to refactor what you have created. So in our case, as I said, if you want to change something in that movie card that you have right here, you would go to the components folder and you would search for something called movie card. And right now you would not find that. So let's simply right click on our component folder. Let's create a new file. Let's call it MovieCard.js and make sure that it's written in camel case. So first letter of every word is a capital letter, MovieCard.js. As always, we want to make sure that we import React. We can remove useEffect and useState. We only need React right here, style CSS, and then we simply export default function movie card. There we go. Now maybe you have noticed that we are always using that empty parentheses, but let me tell you, it's the last time that they will be empty, because we will now put in something there, but I want to give you some more context first. So let's return a div right here, just like that. We basically want to copy over what we have done in the MovieGrid.js, right? So here you can see that we create a div, right? This is one movie card. Here's our movies grid, and here we have the map. Let's copy this one here, copy, right? And then remove it so that the map here inside is empty. Let's keep it like this just for a second and switch back to your div here. Let me just replace that one with the div that we have just created here. And if it doesn't look well formatted, you can simply highlight that one. Then you can click on format document or format selection. If you do that and you have not configured a default formatter, I just removed mine. So let's click on configure, right? Let's choose prettier code formatter. Let's give it a second and there we go. Cool. So if we now hit Control save, then also the format on save will get applied, right? That's what the extension that we have installed previously. So you can now see div key movie, and movie is underlined red because he doesn't know what a movie is, right? Where should he know this from? So we are rendering a movie card, but we don't know the movie, right? So our movie card component needs to know about, hey, which movie do I need to render? What are the informations? What does that movie look like? And now is the first time when we submit a so-called component property. And if you are familiar with another programming language or JavaScript, then you know that we can simply write down a parameter into an argument into our function. Now in React, we have to wrap that into our curly braces and then write down movie here. Now we have an object, and inside that we have the movie. Now you can see that it is working, but that was just the rendering side of view, right? So if we save it, then we're basically done here. We just pasted the code in and assigned a parameter here, right, for our component. Now let's switch back to our MovieGrid.js. Now what we are doing here is basically we go to the very top and we import our movie card. Then we scroll down, and for the map procedure here, we will simply now create a movie card. So again, for every movie inside of our movies array, he will now render a card. But the problem is that if we would try to run that now, just like this, and don't get confused, now he's starting to format the code, right? If we take a look at our application, you can see it is empty, right? There is nothing here. If we reload the page, you can even see errors because he doesn't know properties of undefined. Why is it undefined? Well, we are rendering the card, but we are not providing information about which movie do we want to render. So we have to put in the value here. And it's quite easy to do that. Inside of our opening tag from the component here, we can simply provide a value for movie, right? So we say, hey, we want to specify a value for the parameter movie right here. And the value that we want to provide basically is the movie, right? Movie. Now, in order to keep track for the mapping so that React still knows which ID is associated with which movie so that we keep the key, we can also define key equals to movie.id so that, as I said, if we say, hey, we want to have the movie card with where the movie is ID 3, for example, he will give us the correct one. Great. Now save it like this. We are now providing the movie, right? So here the value gets sent in. And if we take a look, you can see it's working again. Now we have successfully, well, refactored our code, and you have learned something new. You have learned how to create component properties and how to submit values for them, right? Here we have our movies array, we have our mapping procedure, so we are transforming that so we get access to every movie, and we are creating that component and say, hey, here, this is your associated movie. Great. Hey, congratulations, you have reached the end of this beginner tutorial on React. I hope that you have enjoyed building the first part of the MovieDux web application, and if you were able to follow along, you have learned a lot about React already. But there is still so much more to discover. So if you want to continue your journey of learning React together with me, make sure to check out my full course in the description below. The course covers every important React topic. So enroll now and learn React from A to Z, well, together with me. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you back next time or in my course.